Recent studies have shown that the cost of discovery is rising. Everything is very expensive, mainly due to the volumes of data that people have. As people don't delete information, the volumes are growing and growing and growing. Studies have shown that cost is anywhere from $5,000 to $30,000 per gig for every case. One study has that at about $18,000 per gig. If you think about it, if every person has a 64 gig thumb drive, that would be approximately $1 million for just simply that one thumb drive, if that data is completely full. And that's crazy. Most people have more than one thumb drive. They have a computer, they have a phone, they have all these different sources of data. And if everything is full and you're having to go through and look at every one of those files, a case is going to be extraordinarily expensive. And people are being very, very cost conscious these days. And so it's imperative to reduce the overall cost as much as possible in any way that you can. There's a lot of different phases of the EDRM, but if you think about the process, $18,000 per gig throughout the entire process is extraordinarily expensive. The main driver of the cost is that everything is electronic these days. Studies have shown that most corporate information, 93% of it is electronic, and that is simply growing every day. The actual most expensive piece of the process is the review time, is the time that humans are actually looking at documents. And so anything that you can do to reduce the overall cost of a case is really key. If you're able to reduce the volume of documents down to the actual documents that people need to look at as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible, you can reduce the actual review time and the cost associated with the review. Companies are doing more and more on their own, but they are actually storing documents even longer. They're storing documents in more and more secure ways for their own processes, for their own business practices, to ensure that they're not losing information. And so they themselves are part of the problem. They may have information on backup tapes, they may have documents on the server, they may allow people to store information on their computers. Some are restricting people so they can't store things on thumb drives. It really just kind of depends. But companies are saving more than they ever did because things are electronic. They're not overburdened by having boxes and boxes of paper in their office when you can have a very small hard drive that has the same information. And so it's very imperative to really take this process seriously because these cases can get very expensive very quickly otherwise. Companies are often, even these days, just simply settling to avoid having to pay the exorbitant cost of e-discovery. And that's really kind of sad. You really, you don't want to see people simply give up because the process is just too expensive. There are many things that you can do to really drive down the cost of e-discovery. As we mentioned, one of the biggest ones is culling and deduplication, reducing the volume as much as possible. But there are also processes that can be done as well. You can target your collection differently. You can ensure that you're only getting the specific documents you need by eliminating cell phones, by eliminating network shares, not having to go to backup tapes. Any of those steps that you can do up front really reduce the volume of documents that you have, which then ultimately reduce the volume of documents you have to review later. Maybe you can sample the data. Maybe once you collect the documents, you process the data, and then you only look at a key custodian or a key couple of custodians to try to eliminate ultimate data that you have to look at later. If you can do that, again, that helps reduce the cost of e-discovery. There are technologies such as predictive coding that can assist in the process of automating a lot of the steps. There are also processes where you can reuse the documents from case to case to case. If you have a corporation that gets sued a lot, and you're able to reuse documents from a previous case and actually be able to leverage the work product that somebody actually did already, maybe you don't have to review those documents a second time. Maybe you're able to go through and simply take that work product and move that document forward. That can be really useful because then you don't have to pay the price of actually having to review that document a second time, or worse, a third, fourth, fifth time. As I mentioned, predictive coding is really a great way to reduce the cost of this process. Predictive coding is using technology to assist the review. There are many tools out there that allow for computers to really automate the process of first pass review. You're automating the process of having somebody to have to go in and look at the documents initially. Predictive coding technologies exist to really help ease that burden and allow people to find documents that are key and then use technology to find like documents like those in an effort to streamline the process. Studies have shown that if you normal human reviews of documents about 40 or so docs an hour. After using predictive coding technologies, that rate increases to closer to 65, 70 docs an hour. And so if you're using technology that is done right, if you're using technology to really leverage that process, you can save cost, you can save time, and you can reduce the overall burden in a case. The idea of predictive coding, as I mentioned, is to take documents, to find key documents, and then build models off of those documents in an effort to find like documents like those. There's different technologies that do this process. There's a handful of different tools out there. There's the traditional method that people use where they build a seed set using key documents, and then they find like documents by pushing that seed set through the remaining population. There's also now continuous active learning technologies that exist on the market. These technologies are oftentimes better because they don't have a seed set. You're not really burdened by having to have somebody really go through and find good documents up front. You can build models of documents. You can find very representative information and then push those models through the remaining population to try to find all of your good documents. This process is really helpful because once that model is built and you push those documents, that model through the remaining documents, you may not have to review the entire set of documents. And if you're able to eliminate sets of documents that you don't have to review, that simply saves costs, that saves time. There's a lot of key things in predictive coding, but the continuous active learning is really a leap forward. The seed set process that exists in many of the tools that are on the market today are very cumbersome. They take a lot of time. Oftentimes you have to look at 4,000 or 5,000 documents to build your set to be able to produce your model. If your case only has 5,000, 6,000 documents, there's no reason to use these technologies, and that's really a shame. In your cases where you've got 1 million documents, 5 million documents, oftentimes you have no choice but to use these technologies. And using one of the continuous active learning applications is oftentimes really a great way to go because the system is learning as you go. You're looking at documents and the system is then resorting the pile of documents so that your good documents are rising to the top, your bad documents are going away from you, and so you're able to find your documents a lot faster. You're able to find your documents significantly easier than you would if you were to do it in the traditional method where you build a seed set and have to identify your seed documents up front. Many of the technologies that exist on the market these days have monitoring of the models. They do it in real time, so you can actually see how you're doing and you can actually see where you are. And once you've built your model, you can then push your model through your remaining documents and never actually have to look at all the documents. Or if you do, you're doing it in a way that is smarter because all your documents are pre-organized into your categories. So your reviewers are spending less time trying to figure out if a document is good or bad and ultimately trying to figure out if a document is really what they're looking for. With these technologies, for folks who don't know what they're looking for, oftentimes they can use these tools to be able to go through and do a review, and the system will then resort based on the review and find like documents that are beyond their search terms, that are beyond their words, and if they don't know what they're looking for, but they'll know it if they see it, these technologies can be really key because they allow them to really do a level of base review and then have the set get smarter and smarter as they're reviewing more and more documents. Some of the technologies these days even allow you to save off the model and apply that model to future data sets so that if you have a case that starts out with 6 custodians and then grows to 8 custodians, you have the ability to leverage that model and push that model through that population, potentially without even looking at that new set. You may be able to even save off the model and use it from case to case to case. So if you are using a class action or you're in a class action lawsuit, you have the ability to use that model and organize your documents from case 1, case 2, case 3, using the model you've created in case 1. That itself could be a huge cost savings, a huge time savings, because you're leveraging the work product that you have from a case earlier through future cases and future data sets. As long as the documents are statistically similar, you should have no problem. The documents should organize very nicely into their categories, and you're eliminating steps throughout the review process, which can ultimately save tons of cost, tons of time. The key with this is that the process of e-discovery, if done right, can save time, can save energy, can reduce the overall cost of a litigation. These documents are not going anywhere. People have to look through them, and so by having the technology, having the tools, and really understanding the process, you can really streamline the work that you have to do later. Ultimately, this is about getting the documents into the subject matter expert, the person who's doing the analysis' hands, and so by taking the time to understand the process, you can reduce the amount of documents they have to look at, you can eliminate totally irrelevant data sets, and you can really be focusing in on the process that you need to really find the documents that you need to. And honestly, these days, failure to adhere to the practices, the best practices in e-discovery, will have massively detrimental results. One, at minimum, you're going to spend extra time, you're going to spend extra costs, both in the actual process, but even in court fees and in loss of time and what have you. But even worse, nowadays, you can literally go to jail. The courts have been very, unfriendly to messing up this process. There are a handful of court cases out there. There's an Arthur Andersen case, the Qualcomm case, the Victor Stanley case. These are cases where people have gotten in trouble, people have really messed up this process of e-discovery and then been sanctioned, they've been fined. In the Victor Stanley case, literally people went to jail. And so if you don't take this process seriously, if you mess this process up, it can have huge implications, both in loss of time and loss of energy, but also loss of freedom. And that's very serious. And so it's imperative to take this process seriously. It's imperative to ensure that you're doing this in a process that is right, that is forensically sound, and that ultimately makes sense. If you can defend your actions and you can justify the course that you've taken, that's really important. It's very imperative that you make sure that you're doing this in a way that is useful, but also ultimately delivers the results that you need, as well as the subject matter expert needs to be able to do their work. And that's really key.